In late 2024, a team of researchers fed 50 years of killer whale recordings into a neural network designed to detect patterns in animal communication. The dataset contained thousands of hours of vocalizations from orca populations across the Pacific Northwest. Calls recorded by hydrophones anchored to the seafloor. Sounds captured by researchers who had tracked the same families across 5 generations. Mothers and daughters and granddaughters, their voices preserved in digital archives spanning half a century. The algorithm processed it all, searching for structure hidden in the noise. What it found was not what scientists expected. For decades, researchers believed they understood orca communication at a basic level. Different pods had different calls, regional variations, acoustic dialects like the difference between a Boston accent and a Texas drawl. Interesting for biologists, certainly, evidence of social learning and cultural transmission, but ultimately simple, the same language spoken with local flavor. The AI revealed something else entirely. These were not dialects. Neighboring pods that swam the same waters, hunted the same salmon runs, and encountered each other regularly produced calls that shared almost nothing in common. The algorithm found no bridge between them, no shared vocabulary, no overlapping structure. Pods living miles apart had developed what could only be described as entirely separate languages, not variations on a theme, completely different systems of communication that had diverged so far they might as well have evolved on separate planets. And some of those languages are dying. The southern resident killer whales, the most studied orca population on Earth, numbered just 73 individuals. Each death removes a voice from a vocal tradition passed down across centuries. When a dialect falls silent, everything encoded in those calls disappears with it. Hunting techniques, social bonds, accumulated knowledge. We cannot yet translate and may never have the chance to understand. This is not a story about discovering that orcas are intelligent. We have known that for 50 years. This is a story about what we chose to ignore, what we allowed to be destroyed, and what might still be saved before the last speakers fall silent. The recordings began in the 1970s. Researchers lowered hydrophones into the cold waters off British Columbia and captured sounds that had never been properly documented. Orcas clicking and whistling and producing pulsed calls that resonated through the deep. The audio quality was primitive by modern standards, but it was enough to reveal something unexpected. Different groups of killer whales sounded completely different from one another. This should have been revolutionary. Scientists were hearing evidence that orca pods maintained distinct acoustic traditions, unique repertoires of calls that remained stable over time. A pod recorded one year would produce the same calls the next year, and the year after that. But a different pod just miles away would produce entirely different sounds. The patterns were consistent, the implications were profound. Instead, the discovery was filed away as a curiosity. The scientific consensus of the era left little room for animal culture. Behaviorism still dominated the field. Animals responded to stimuli. They did not have traditions. They did not pass down knowledge. They certainly did not speak different languages. The idea that killer whales might maintain vocal cultures as distinct as human ethnic groups seemed like romantic projection, the kind of anthropomorphic thinking that serious researchers were trained to reject. John Ford changed that, at least partially. Working in the 1980s, he conducted the first systematic analysis of northern resident orca dialects. He documented call types. He mapped which pods shared which vocalizations. He proved that the differences were real, consistent, and structured. His work established beyond doubt that orca vocal repertoires were learned rather than innate. Calves acquired their pods' calls over years of listening. Culture, not genetics, determined how an orca spoke. But even Ford's careful research was interpreted conservatively. Dialects, regional accents, variations on a universal orca communication system. The framing kept the findings safely within acceptable boundaries. Yes, pods sounded different. No, this did not mean anything radical about orca cognition or society. The recordings accumulated. The differences were documented. Researchers noted that pods with different dialects seemed unable to communicate effectively when they encountered each other. But for decades, the obvious question went unasked. If these were not merely accents, if neighboring pods that shared the same waters could not understand one another at all, what exactly were orcas saying that required entirely separate languages to express? The evidence mounted slowly, but it mounted undeniably. Researchers discovered that orca calves are not born knowing their pod's calls. They learn them. During the first years of life, a young orca listens to its mother, its siblings, its extended family. It absorbs the sounds around it and gradually acquires the vocal repertoire of its group. The process takes years. A calf's early attempts are imprecise, rough approximations that sharpen over time until they match the calls of the adults. This is not instinct. This is education. The proof came from an unexpected source. Captive orcas, removed from their natal pods and housed with strangers, began adopting the calls of their tank mates. Animals that had produced one set of vocalizations for years gradually shifted to match the sounds of the orcas around them. One documented case went even further. An orca housed with bottlenose dolphins learned to produce dolphin-like clicks and whistles, sounds no wild killer whale would ever make. The animal had not lost its original vocal capacity. It had added a new one. It had learned a foreign language because that was who it lived with now. The separation between orca ecotypes made the linguistic divisions even starker. Resident orcas eat fish. Transient orcas hunt marine mammals. Offshore orcas target sharks. These three groups occupy the same waters along the Pacific coast. They are the same species. They can interbreed, though they almost never do, and they cannot understand each other. Their vocal repertoires share virtually nothing. A resident call played to transient orcas produces no recognition. The sounds might as well be static. Decades of separate cultural evolution have produced communication systems so divergent that mutual comprehension appears impossible. Three populations swimming the same ocean, speaking three entirely different languages. The complexity within each system defied early assumptions. Individual calls were not simple signals. They contained frequency modulations, timing variations, and structural elements that researchers struggled to categorize. Pods that reunited after separation performed what could only be described as greeting ceremonies, exchanges of specific calls that seemed to confirm identity and affiliation. Different activities produced different vocalizations: hunting calls, traveling calls, socializing calls. The repertoire was not a handful of fixed signals. It was an extensive vocabulary deployed according to context. This was not accent variation. This was the difference between Mandarin and Portuguese. Same species, same ocean, completely different linguistic systems. And the question no one could answer was why evolution would produce that. Why would killer whales need entirely separate languages when simpler communication would serve survival just as well? Unless the languages carried something more than simple messages. The breakthrough required more than recordings. It required context. In 1970, a researcher named Paul Spong made a decision that would shape orca science for the next half-century. He established Orca Lab on a remote island in British Columbia, positioned directly in the path of northern resident killer whale migration routes. He installed hydrophones in the surrounding waters, and then he listened. For 50 years, the lab recorded every vocalization that passed through those waters. Not sporadically, not during occasional research expeditions, continuously. Day and night, season after season, decade after decade. The hydrophones captured mothers calling to calves, pods greeting each other after separation, hunting parties coordinating in the kelp forests. The archive grew into something unprecedented. Thousands upon thousands of hours of orca communication from a single population tracked across generations. But Spong and his colleagues did more than record sounds. They identified individuals. They learned to recognize specific orcas by their dorsal fins and saddle patches, unique markings as distinctive as human fingerprints. They gave them designations and tracked their movements. They documented births and deaths. They watched calves mature into juveniles, juveniles into adults, adults into mothers and grandmothers. They built family trees spanning 5 generations. The Center for Whale Research pursued similar work with the southern resident population. Beginning in 1976, researchers conducted annual censuses of every individual in the community. They photographed each orca. They recorded its associations, its family connections, its reproductive history. They knew which whales were siblings, which were cousins, which had formed lasting bonds, and which avoided each other. This was the data that made everything else possible. Other researchers had recorded orca vocalizations before. Marine parks had hours of captive whale sounds. Opportunistic recordings existed from research vessels around the world, but those recordings lacked something essential. They were audio without context, sounds without stories. Researchers could hear calls but could not know which specific orca produced them, Who was listening? What relationships connected the animals? What had happened before and what followed after? The long-term field programs had all of it. They knew the animals by sight. They knew family histories stretching back decades. When they recorded a call, they could often identify exactly which individual made it, which relatives were nearby, what social situation prompted the vocalization. They had sound married to meaning. That combination is what artificial intelligence needed to find the patterns humans had missed. The problem was scale. 50 years of recordings, thousands of hours of audio, multiple individuals vocalizing simultaneously, their calls overlapping and interweaving, ocean noise contaminating everything, boat engines, wave action, the clicks of shrimp, and the songs of distant humpbacks. Somewhere in that chaos were the patterns that could unlock orca communication. But finding them through human analysis alone would take lifetimes. A researcher listening to a recording might identify a dozen call types in an hour of careful work. The archive contained enough material to occupy a team of scientists for centuries. And even with unlimited time, human ears have limits. We hear broad strokes. We miss subtleties. Variations in timing measured in milliseconds. Frequency modulations spanning ranges we cannot consciously distinguish. The data held secrets that human perception was simply not equipped to detect. The solution came from the same technology transforming human language processing. Neural networks designed to find patterns in sequential data. The same basic architecture that powers translation software and chatbots, retrained for a different purpose. Instead of human text, the models ingested spectrograms, visual representations of sound that display frequency changes over time. A rising whistle becomes a climbing line. A series of clicks becomes a rhythm of dots. The complexity of orca vocalizations, impossible to process as raw audio, became images that machine learning could analyze. The algorithms required no instructions about what to look for. They simply searched for regularities, patterns that repeated, sequences that followed rules, relationships between sounds that remained consistent across different recordings, different years, different generations of the same family line. What emerged was not a dictionary. The AI could not translate specific calls into specific meanings, but it found something arguably more important: structure. Consistent patterns in how calls were ordered, rules about which sounds tended to follow which other sounds, regularities that persisted across decades of recordings from the same populations. The machine detected what human researchers had suspected but could never prove. The calls were not random. They were not simple reflexive signals. They were organized according to principles that looked less like animal communication and more like the foundations of grammar. The first revelation concerned flexibility. Orca calls were not fixed signals with fixed meanings. The same fundamental call type could be produced in measurably different ways, depending on circumstances. A call made during active hunting differed from the same call made during relaxed socializing. The base structure remained recognizable, but the execution changed. Timing stretched or compressed. Frequency contours shifted. Elements were emphasized or softened. This was not noise or random variation. The modifications were consistent. Excitement produced one set of changes. Urgency produced another. Calm produced another still. The AI detected these patterns across thousands of examples, correlating acoustic variations with behavioral context documented by field researchers. The orcas were not just producing calls. They were modulating them, adjusting delivery to convey something beyond the basic signal itself. The second revelation cut deeper. Call combinations followed rules. When researchers analyzed sequences of vocalizations, they found that certain calls tended to follow certain other calls with statistical regularity. The ordering was not random. Specific patterns repeated across different recording sessions, different years, different individuals within the same pod. The AI identified what appeared to be syntactic structure, rules governing how vocal elements could be combined, constraints on what sequences were permissible and what sequences never occurred. This is the architecture of language, not just vocabulary but grammar, not just words but rules for assembling words into larger meaningful units. The evidence remained preliminary. Researchers could not yet prove that different sequences carried different meanings, but the structural regularities were undeniable. Something was being organized according to consistent principles. The third revelation emerged from analysis of pod-specific calls. Some vocalizations appeared to function as identifiers, signature sounds associated with particular family groups, possibly with particular individuals. The research paralleled findings from dolphin studies, where signature whistles serve as names. Orcas may possess something similar, acoustic markers that designate specific social units, allowing pods to announce their identity across miles of ocean. But the fourth revelation was the one that changed everything. Different ecotypes did not merely sound different, their vocal repertoires appeared to encode different knowledge. Resident orcas that hunt salmon possess calls that transient orcas lack entirely. Transients that hunt marine mammals use vocalizations residents never produce. The languages diverged because the cultures diverged. Each ecotype developed communication systems suited to its specific way of life, its specific hunting techniques, its specific survival strategies. The calls may carry the knowledge itself. Acoustic traditions encoding where to find prey, how to coordinate attacks, when to hunt, and when to rest. Information passed from mother to calf not through genetic inheritance but through vocal teaching. This is the point where the research crosses a line. We are no longer discussing communication. We are confronting the possibility that orca languages encode survival. Knowledge accumulated across generations. Techniques, locations, strategies, wisdom. If that is true, then when a dialect dies, the knowledge dies with it. Every silenced voice takes part of the library. In August 2018, a southern resident orca known to researchers as J35 gave birth to a calf. The infant lived for half an hour. When it died, the mother did not let go. For 17 days, J35 carried her dead calf through the Salish Sea. She balanced the body on her head. She dove to retrieve it when it slipped beneath the surface. She pushed it through the water for more than 1,000 miles. Other members of her pod took turns helping, supporting the small corpse so J35 could rest. Researchers watched in astonishment as the mourning continued day after day, the mother refusing to abandon what remained of her child. Mourning. This was not instinct. Instinct does not produce coordinated assistance from family members. Instinct does not sustain behavior for weeks beyond any biological purpose. What researchers witnessed was grief. Profound, visible, undeniable grief expressed through actions that served no survival function whatsoever. J35 knew her calf was dead. She carried it anyway, because letting go was not something she could do. The orcas remember. They remember each other. They remember places and events and relationships spanning decades. Matriarchs lead their families to hunting grounds their own grandmothers showed them. Techniques specific to particular regions persist across generations, taught and retaught, refined and preserved. Norwegian orcas use carousel feeding to herd herring into tight balls before striking. Antarctic orcas coordinate wave-washing attacks to knock seals off ice floes. These behaviors are not genetic. They are learned. They are cultural. They are knowledge carried in memory and transmitted through teaching. When a matriarch dies, her knowledge goes with her. Studies have shown that pods suffering matriarch loss experience measurably worse survival outcomes. The old females carry information that younger animals lack. Where to find salmon in lean years, how to navigate changing conditions. Wisdom accumulated across 60 or 70 years of life, irreplaceable once lost. The southern resident population contains 73 individuals. In the 1990s, they numbered nearly 100. Each death removes a voice from a vocal tradition that may stretch back thousands of years. Calls that have been passed from mother to daughter across countless generations fall silent when the last speaker dies. We have a term for this when it happens to human languages. We call it cultural death. We call it the extinction of knowledge. We mourn it as a tragedy beyond the loss of individual lives. The AI can decode the structure of orca calls. It can identify patterns and regularities that human ears could never detect, but it cannot recover what has already been lost. It cannot reconstruct the calls of orcas who died before the recordings began. It cannot restore knowledge that vanished when the last whale who held it slipped beneath the waves and did not resurface. We are not watching a species decline. We are watching a culture fall silent. Approximately 60 orcas remain in captivity worldwide. They live in concrete tanks a fraction of the size these animals would travel in a single day in the wild. A free orca might swim 100 miles between sunrise and sunset. A captive orca swims in circles. The same walls, the same water, the same endless repetition until death. Nearly every male orca in captivity has a collapsed dorsal fin. In the wild, this condition affects less than 1% of the population. In tanks, it is almost universal. The fin, unsupported by the constant swimming and deep diving that would occur in natural conditions, folds over under its own weight. The industry claimed for years this was normal. It is not normal. It is a visible marker of physical deterioration caused by confinement. Tilikum was captured off the coast of Iceland in 1983. He was approximately 2 years old. He spent the next 33 years in marine park tanks, first in Canada, then in Florida. He killed 3 people during his captivity. After the final death in 2010, he was isolated from other orcas for extended periods. He floated listlessly at the surface of his tank. He gnawed on concrete walls and metal gates until his teeth were destroyed. He died in 2017, having spent nearly his entire life in a space smaller than a parking lot. But the cruelty extends beyond physical confinement. Captive orcas are routinely housed with individuals from different populations, animals that would never encounter each other in the wild, that speak entirely different vocal dialects, forced to share the same small enclosure. They cannot understand each other. They produce their calls and receive nothing recognizable in response. Linguistic isolation in a concrete box surrounded by creatures who might as well be speaking alien tongues. They call out. No one who speaks their language answers. The ocean offers no refuge from human impact. Commercial shipping has transformed the underwater acoustic environment into a constant assault of engine noise. Vessel traffic in the Salish Sea, home to the southern residents, has increased dramatically over decades. The orcas must vocalize over the din. Studies show their calls have become louder, shorter, simpler. They are shouting to be heard. They are compressing their communication to punch through the noise. If their vocalizations carry complex information, that information is being degraded every time a tanker passes overhead. Navy sonar exercises produce sounds loud enough to cause physical injury. Strandings and deaths have been linked to sonar testing. The military acknowledges the connection but continues the exercises. The orcas have no recourse. They cannot file complaints. They cannot relocate to quieter waters. They absorb the assault and endure what they cannot escape. The southern residents are starving. Their survival depends on Chinook salmon, and Chinook populations have collapsed. Dams block spawning routes. Overfishing depletes stocks. Habitat destruction eliminates the rivers where salmon reproduce. The orcas that remain grow thin. Pregnancies fail. Calves that survive birth often die within their first year. A population that should be growing is instead slowly vanishing. Starving mothers cannot teach. Stressed populations cannot maintain cultural traditions. The knowledge encoded in their vocalizations requires transmission from generation to generation. When reproduction fails, when calves die, when the chain of teaching breaks, the culture begins to collapse even before the last individual is gone. We have known about orca dialects for 40 years. We have known about cultural transmission for at least 20. We understood that these animals maintain traditions, pass down knowledge, communicate in ways that differ fundamentally from simple animal signaling. We knew enough to suspect they might possess something approaching language. We kept them in tanks anyway. We kept building dam anyway. We kept running ships through their habitat anyway. If we ever make contact with intelligent life beyond Earth, our treatment of orcas will be part of our record, evidence of how humanity responds when confronted with non-human minds. The data was there. We understood enough to know better. We chose not to act. The research is accelerating. Project CETI, initially focused on sperm whale communication, has begun expanding its methodologies to other cetacean species. The same neural network architectures that detected structure in dolphin vocalizations are being trained on orca datasets. The 50 years of recordings from British Columbia and Washington State represent exactly the kind of context-rich archive that machine learning requires. Known individuals, documented relationships, sound married to meaning across generations. Real-time processing is becoming possible. Hydrophones feeding data directly to algorithms that can identify call types, detect patterns, and flag anomalies as they occur. Not analysis months after the fact, but monitoring in the moment. Researchers may soon be able to track not just where orcas are swimming, but what they are saying as they swim. The legal implications are significant. Conservation law has traditionally protected species based on population numbers and ecological roles. But if orca vocalizations demonstrate linguistic complexity, approaching what we recognize in human language, the arguments for expanded protection become harder to dismiss. Non-human personhood, once a fringe philosophical position, gains scientific weight with each new finding. Acoustic sanctuaries, zones where vessel traffic and industrial noise are restricted to protect communication, have been proposed for critical orca habitat. The research provides ammunition for advocates who have long argued that intelligence deserves legal consideration. Playback experiments have already demonstrated something remarkable. When researchers broadcast recorded orca calls into the water, the animals respond. They approach the speakers. They vocalize back. They react differently to to calls from their own population than to calls from foreign groups. The responses are not random. The orcas are listening carefully and answering deliberately. This is not translation. We cannot yet ask a question and understand the reply, but the channel is open. The orcas hear us when we speak their sounds back to them. They recognize something meaningful in the signal. They engage. For 50 years, the hydrophones have been recording. The orcas have been speaking, calling to each other across miles of ocean, teaching their young, mourning their dead, carrying on conversations we could hear but never comprehend. The AI is finally finding the patterns buried in that archive, structure, rules, the bones of something that looks uncomfortably like language. But the real question was never whether we could decode what they are saying. It was whether we would change our behavior once we understood, whether the knowledge would matter, whether proof of intelligence would translate into protection. The orcas are still waiting for an answer.